Thank you to the Scottish Government for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come to Edinburgh, even though today was a little bit wet, but it stopped just as the train got into Waverley, so I was very pleased about that. I'm here to give you a bit of the global picture on the energy transition, because I work for the International Energy Agency. Now, just a couple of words on who we are. We're an international organization. We're linked to the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. But we, these days, represent most of the big energy countries, if you like, the big energy consumers. So we have our member states, our 29, and many of the Arctic countries are part of our member states, but we also work with India, with China, with Brazil. Only Russia is the one country where we don't have a close relationship, but still we do some technological collaboration with them. So part of our remit is really to advise governments on where they should be going on energy, how to bring about the energy transition. And we do this partially through doing a lot of analysis, and I want to give you some of our insights on where we think the energy system has to go to. Now, you've already heard about climate change today from Lord Deben and from the First Minister, the importance of achieving the UK targets, the Paris targets, and it's really going to be very challenging. So, in our World Energy Outlook, which we published just a couple of weeks ago, we've looked at, well, to achieve the targets Paris requires us to do, how do we need to do it? And with that analysis, we're currently only going to 2040, but we're saying, okay, you know, in 2040, you'll have to have reduced emissions by this much to get to the Paris targets. And if you look at this chart, you can see it's basically all about energy efficiency and renewables. And renewables is the main thing I want to talk about here, but let's not forget about energy efficiency. Those two need to work hand in hand. And let's not kid ourselves, this is going to be very, very challenging. Now, a lot of good stuff has already happened. And just looking, for example, at renewable power, if you look at what's been happening in the last 5-6 years, it's quite exciting, actually. So a lot of new power capacity is being built globally. Obviously, in countries, in the emerging economies, is where we get most of the net additions in power capacity, but there's a lot happening elsewhere as well. And renewables have now overtaken coal and gas. In fact, for the first time, I think, last year, if you add up coal and gas together, we've gone past that with renewables. Solar PV has suddenly taken off. Wind power is doing pretty well. Hydro is being added, and we'll talk later on about some of the other renewables. Whereas, you know, coal is still being built at too fast a rate if you want to achieve climate change targets, but, you know, there has been a real change. And in our analysis, looking forward to the next 23 years to 2040, we see the coal build being reduced significantly. Gas, well, it'll probably still be important in the next 23 years, but if you look at what's going to happen on an annual basis on renewables, it's going to get even faster. This is all annual additions, right? So you've seen what happened in the last 6 years, and then we see this getting more rapid, and especially solar PV really racing ahead. So that's all very exciting. And there's lots of other development going on in renewables where we hopefully seeing things we maybe don't quite expect yet on marine energy. So in 2016, we've had renewables providing an all-time record of 2/3 of the global net capacity additions. And part of this has been, Andy's already mentioned it, the costs of renewables really have plummeted. But, and I think there's always a but, we need to keep in mind that a lot of this is the very large-scale renewable projects. The solar PV that's really cheap is big solar farms that are coming forward in very favorable locations. So we need to also keep in mind that when we're talking about local solutions, it's not all going to be cheap as in per kilowatt hour, but if you're looking at system costs and replacing diesel, it's actually still very good. So we have a very competitive renewables environment now, certainly for wind and solar PV, and we see costs continuing to come down. We're looking forward 5 years here, and they're getting quite low. But, another but, you know, we shouldn't just think about electricity. Electricity is only about 20% of end use, or even under 20%, and most of our energy is used as heat. So heat for space heating, heat for industry, about 50-50. And of course, when we're talking about the Arctic, heat is incredibly important. And yet, most of my colleagues, most of conferences I go to, all I hear is heat. So I'm very pleased that this morning there was, is electricity. So I was very pleased this morning already having heard about the importance of heat and then the need to think beyond electricity. So heat, of course, globally is mainly produced by fossil fuels. We haven't seen that really rapid take-up of renewable heat. We haven't seen much in terms of cost reductions. In fact, we probably don't even know how much most renewable heat costs. So globally, we think we're getting about 7% of heat from renewables, and I say think because the data is appalling. Electricity also plays a role because some of electricity is, of course, from renewables. So we're talking about 9%, the two added together. And, of course, in many countries, it looks even worse. I mean, there's many countries where you get something like 90% of heat from fossil fuels. So this is something we really need to address and need to address it rapidly. Now, if you look what's happening globally, I mean, clearly heat has to be done locally. It has to be about local solutions, because it's not so simple of saying, yeah, you know, this is just about, with electricity is electricity, and it's much more simple, whereas with heat, you need to think about what is your heat demand, is it for industry, is it for space heating, if you have district heating, what kind of temperatures have you got, and it's quite complicated, but on the resource side as well, it varies from place to place. But if you're looking around the Arctic, there are all sorts of really good examples of progress that's been made. So clearly, geothermal, Iceland is the absolute leader, and Iceland is actually transferring the knowledge to China these days. We've seen biomass boilers used to heat greenhouses in Alaska, just an example. Excess heat from mining in the north of Sweden, and ground source heat pumps being used all over the Nordics. So solutions are being found, but there needs to be a lot more done, and in many places it is still about diesel, so we need to think about how do we get away from that. And you've already heard there'll be a lot more linking in the future as well of electricity, heat, and a transport sector. So on electricity, again, I mean, there are solutions in the north, but more is needed. And this is quite an interesting example, actually. Solar PV, which I already showed you, has really taken off globally. It is transforming access to energy in many remote communities. And we're thinking, of course, here more sub-Saharan Africa and places like that. But in the north, there is quite a lot of potential. And my example here of the vertical bifacial solar PV is something a Swiss company is trying to bring to the north of Russia, for example. And the albedo effect with the snow helps. Great potential for wind power, of course, in many Arctic regions, both for local supply and export. But you need to think about flexibility options. Now, I'm mentioning here batteries, but there are other options like hydrogen, which we'll hear about later. So to conclude, because I've only got 10 seconds left, right? There will be a massive transition needed from fossil fuels to renewables. And we need much better energy efficiency. No one has any doubt about that, although how we bring it about is challenging. It is great that we're seeing solar PV and wind power getting cheaper, but it is still questionable how we can get this more into remote communities. And I hope to hear some good examples from my colleagues afterwards. And I think I made it clear that we really need to think beyond electricity. Electricity is important, but heat is really absolutely key globally. We can't decarbonize our energy system without dealing with heat. So I think there is plenty of scope for local renewable solutions in the Arctic. And I will pass over to my colleagues to give us some examples of what can be done.